Hi guys, welcome to the first podcast for Speedway Biology. We are going to be talking about energy, in particular ATP in this podcast. So we're always going to start out with an essential question like you see right here. So the question today is what is ATP and why is it important? Okay. So by the time we're done with this podcast, I want you to be thinking about that question, and then at the end you should be able to answer what it is and why is it important for living things. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about energy. What is energy? By definition, energy is the ability to do work. We hear about energy when we talk about food. You hear about energy drinks. That simply means that food that we eat or the drink that we're drinking has energy in it that our body can use, but we got to convert it. Okay? Thermodynamics is just the study of how that energy flows in the universe. Because down at the bottom here you see there are two laws that discuss how energy moves from one thing to another within our universe. The first law basically says you cannot make energy, you can't destroy energy, you can only change forms. Okay? There's no such thing as going out and making energy. We can take energy, like from the sun, solar energy, and we can change it or convert it into another form, like electricity. That's why we have solar panels. That's what it is. We are converting that energy. The second law of thermodynamics basically says that every time that we convert energy, we lose some back to the universe. So let's look at ATP. In particular, let's look at how do we go from ATP to ADP. Well, let's backtrack. What is ATP? ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate means it has 3 phosphate groups on it, and that is extremely important. So hang on here, and we'll explain why. But ATP is cell energy. That is the only type of energy that our cells can use. It's like going to a bank. If you're trying to purchase something, you have to have money. If you have something else, that transaction's not going to happen. Well, the energy we take into our body has to be converted into ATP. If it's not ATP, our cells don't know what to do, our cells don't have energy, and our cells will not function. Okay? So ATP has 3 phosphate groups. The other version is called ADP, which stands for adenosine diphosphate, because it only has 2 phosphate groups. And down here you see, this is what goes on inside of our cells all the time. We have ATP energy, that's 3 phosphate groups, and for our cells to use that energy, we got to rip off a phosphate. And if you remember back to chapter 2, we discussed that electrons hold these molecules together. And if we rip off one of these phosphates, what we're really doing is we're exposing those electrons, and we can use those electrons to make energy for our cells. So if we rip off a phosphate group, we now have ADP, adenosine diphosphate. There's only 2. Well, ADP doesn't have as much energy as ATP, so our cells always want ATP. So how do we go back from ADP back to ATP? That's why we eat. We eat food to bring in energy so we can reattach a phosphate. Okay, here's a big word for you. That is called phosphorylation, when we add a phosphate to a molecule. Okay, that energy that we bring in, it kind of goes to analogy. You gotta make or have money to make money. Same thing's true with cells. Cells have to use a little bit of energy to make more energy. Okay, so ATP, what you need to know is ATP is cell energy. That is why we eat. That's the energy that we have to have for our cells to do their jobs. And here's what ATP really looks like. So over here you see 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups, ATP, triphosphate, and here's what ADP. Okay. We say ADP doesn't have as much energy because it's missing a phosphate. Okay, that phosphate group is extremely, extremely important. Where do we get our energy from? Well, here's a review of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and what's that 4th one? Do you remember? Let you think about that. Okay. That last one we don't get energy from, so that's why it's not up here. But carbohydrates, which are basically sugars, okay, that's where we get a lot of our energy. And down here you see we don't store them in large amounts. They're more for quick energy, and we can actually make 36 ATP molecules from 1 glucose molecule. That's pretty efficient. Lipids are for long-term energy. When we talked about macromolecules, if you remember, I said lipids are for long-term energy. Lipids can store a lot of ATP. Give you a comparison, for carbohydrates, we can only make 36 ATP from one glucose. From one triglyceride, which is the monomer for lipids, okay? Remember what monomer means? Hope so. We can get 146 ATP molecules. That's a lot. Okay? That's a lot of energy. Problem is, you don't want to be eating a bunch of lipids because you're going to gain weight, and that can lead to things like heart disease, which is never good. Then down at the bottom, proteins. We don't usually break down proteins for energy, but we can if we have to. Okay? Proteins are mainly used to break down and get those amino acids so we can make different types of proteins. But proteins and carbohydrates produce about the same amount of ATP. So here's a good diagram showing you, okay, for carbohydrates, for every milligram, that's not that important for you to know, but for every milligram we have about 4 calories of energy. Proteins, about 4 calories of energy, and lipids, over 2 times the amount of energy in lipids. Okay, so that's why animals in cold environments, they love to eat fatty foods right before they hibernate, because that's a ton of energy for them. So are you able to answer the essential question? What is ATP? Why is it important? Hopefully what you got out of this is that ATP is cell energy. And it's important because that is the only type of energy that cells can use. Okay? We got to take the energy in through food. If we're a heterotroph like we are, we got to eat that food, we got to break it down and convert it into usable ATP energy for our cells to do their jobs. How do we do that? Well, it's called cellular respiration, and that is coming up in the next podcast. So I hope that helps. See me before school, after school, before class, after class if you have questions. If you can't catch me, send me a message on Facebook or Twitter, Speedway Biology, or send me an email and I'll get back to you. Thanks, and we'll see you guys later.